It was a quiet afternoon on the ranch, the kind where the wind whispers through the grass, and the cows lazily chew on the pasture. But then my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was a local sheriff's department number. My heart sank. What now? I thought. As I answered, the sheriff on the other end spoke calmly, but I could hear the urgency in his voice. "We've received a complaint about you from a homeowners association in your area. They're claiming you're violating some rules." I froze. Homeowners association? I don't even belong to an HOA. How could this be happening? Turns out, this complaint was sparked by someone I'll refer to as HOA Karen. Now, let me tell you about this woman, because she's one of those people that you would never forget once you encounter her. The kind of person who, if given half the chance, will ruin your day, your week, and maybe even your year. To call her overly aggressive is an understatement. She was a woman on a mission, and that mission, apparently, was to enforce her version of perfection on everyone she came across, no matter how irrelevant or misplaced her actions were. She had an almost obsessive need to police everyone around her, to the point where it seemed like she spent every waking moment thinking of ways to make other people's lives miserable. It wasn't enough for her to tend to her own life and property. She constantly found herself in everyone else's business, sticking her nose into things that didn't concern her in the least. It wasn't just about rules. It was about control. I don't know what it is about people like her, but there's this weird satisfaction they get from watching others comply, from seeing that they can get people to toe the line of regulations that, more often than not, are so trivial they barely even matter in the grand scheme of things. But to HOA Karen, these rules were the gospel, and if you weren't following them to the letter, then you were breaking the law in her eyes. Now, I'd heard whispers about her before. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about her, whether they wanted to or not. Some people had a good laugh when her name came up in conversation, while others couldn't help but groan at the mere mention of her. The woman was notorious for making life uncomfortable for everyone she came into contact with. If you weren't adhering to her version of acceptable living, she would waste no time in making you aware of it. From minor infractions, like the improper placement of a flower pot, to the more ridiculous ones, like someone's garage door not being painted the right shade of white, nothing was too small for her to bring up. I remember a neighbor telling me how she once marched up to their front door, clipboard in hand, to tell them that the shade of green they'd chosen for their front porch railing was not approved by the HOA. I mean, come on, it was just a little paint. Yet, she insisted that it was a violation of some obscure regulation hidden deep within the HOA rulebook. Her obsession with these regulations was unmatched, and she always carried with her this air of superiority, as if she alone had unlocked the secret code to living a perfect life. If you wanted to stay on her good side, though it was nearly impossible, you'd have to follow her rules, whether they made sense or not. She took great pride in the idea that she could shape the neighborhood according to her own rigid standards, and she wasted no time in letting everyone know that she was the self-appointed enforcer of that code. But here's the kicker. I didn't even live in her neighborhood. I had no stake in her HOA drama. I didn't care about her ridiculous regulations or her attempt to micromanage people's lives. My ranch was on the outskirts, far away from her little bubble of control. I wasn't a part of her HOA, and I certainly didn't ask to be dragged into it. But somehow, someway, she had decided that my property, my land, and my lifestyle needed to be scrutinized. She made the assumption that I was somehow violating her precious rules, even though I didn't owe her anything. It was like she couldn't stand the idea that someone, especially someone with a piece of land right under her nose, wasn't playing by the same rules she imposed on everyone else. There I was, living my life on my own property, doing my own thing, when she decided I needed to be brought into her world of micro-regulations. I could not believe it. The audacity. Who did this woman think she was? Why did she think she could come onto my land, look around, and judge me for how I managed my property? It was infuriating to think that she had spent so much time, not only making my life uncomfortable, but also causing so much chaos in the neighborhood with her constant complaints and petty battles over things that didn't matter. And now she had the nerve to try to bring that nonsense into my life. The most maddening part was how much time and energy she'd put into this mission of hers. She wasn't just a casual complainer. She was relentless. Every day, she seemed to find something new to report or scrutinize. And it wasn't just my ranch she was eyeing. It was everyone. She had a list, I'm sure of it. A mental list of who she could target next. Who wasn't following the rules in the neighborhood. Who was doing something a little outside of the HOA's accepted norm. If she didn't have something to complain about, she'd make something up. She took pride in it. It wasn't about being right. It was about the control she could wield. Some of my other neighbors had warned me about her, but I thought it was all just gossip. People love to exaggerate, right? But no, this woman was the real deal. She had crossed over from being a harmless pain in the neck to a full-blown nuisance. And now, she dragged me into it. It was as though she couldn't comprehend that someone might not share her values or want to live by her rules. I was under no obligation to listen to her or to bow to her standards. I wasn't a part of her HOA, and yet, here she was, trying to rope me into her little world of petty regulations. The wild part was that she didn't seem to care about that fact. She thought she could force her rules onto me. She had made one of the most fundamental mistakes someone could make when it comes to people like her. She underestimated me. She thought I'd just roll over and accept her self-righteous demands. But I had a different plan in mind. Apparently, HOA Karen had been taking daily walks around the neighborhood, which, on its own, wouldn't have been an issue. But the problem was that she wasn't just walking around her own property, minding her own business. No, she had started wandering around my property as well. And this wasn't a one-time thing. It became a regular routine for her. It seemed like every morning, without fail, she would walk her little route, meandering past my fences, my barns, and my fields. I wasn't aware at first, but eventually, I began to notice. She didn't have the decency to ask permission or give a heads up. She simply showed up on my land as though she had every right to be there. And from the looks of it, she was making mental notes of anything she deemed off or out of place. At first, I dismissed it as harmless. I mean, people walk around their neighborhoods, right? But then, I started hearing things. Whispers from my neighbors, others in the community who had seen her out and about, taking copious notes on her little walks, judging everything from the state of my fences to how my cattle were grazing in the pasture. It was one thing for a neighbor to casually take a walk around, but it was entirely another when someone turned that walk into an unofficial inspection of your property, as though they were the gatekeeper of what was acceptable in the neighborhood. And it wasn't like she was just looking with a casual eye. No, HOA Karen wasn't satisfied unless she was finding violations. She had an eagle-eyed, almost obsessive focus, and she had apparently declared herself the unofficial enforcer of her own interpretation of what was acceptable. She started to pick at everything: the cattle, the fences, the grass. There were a few stray cattle that would sometimes wander further than intended, or there might be an area where the grass was a bit overgrown, but it was all part of the charm of a ranch, wasn't it? It wasn't a perfect, pristine suburban lawn, nor should it be. But apparently, to HOA Karen, this was nothing short of chaos. To her, every misplaced post or errant cow was a catastrophe in the making. As for the fences, sure, they'd seen better days. The harsh weather of the season had caused some wear, and a few of the posts had fallen over. But that's life on a ranch. It's a little messy. It's real. And honestly, repairs were already in progress. The fall was simply a result of a storm that had knocked down some of the old wooden beams. Nothing serious, nothing that couldn't be fixed, but in HOA Karen's eyes, the fences were a glaring violation of her idea of what was acceptable. I could almost hear her voice in my head, complaining about the state of things, as if I was personally offending her by having a few undone repairs. But it didn't stop there. She became fixated on the area around the barn, claiming it was untidy. To her, any semblance of disorganization or disorder was tantamount to blight. The piles of old, unused hay bales that I hadn't gotten around to clearing out, the farm equipment that needed a fresh coat of paint, these were all eyesores, in her opinion. It was almost as if she didn't care about the context of rural living, the fact that ranches are working environments where things get messy sometimes. For her, if it didn't look like the pristine, perfectly manicured homes in her own HOA, with lawns cut to an exact inch and no signs of real life happening, then it wasn't up to her standard. And that meant it was unacceptable. At first, I was taken aback. Was this woman really walking on my property every day, and then judging everything she saw? I couldn't understand how she had gotten so deeply involved in the affairs of someone who wasn't even part of her HOA. I'm not in her HOA. I'm not part of her neighborhood. I didn't sign up for her micromanaging, and I certainly didn't ask her to interfere with my property. But that didn't seem to matter to her. She had some kind of warped sense of entitlement, as though she had the right to dictate how my land should be maintained or what kind of appearance it should have. She didn't see it as her business to stay out of my life. She saw it as her duty to control it. If something wasn't up to code, whether it was on her property or not, she had made it her mission to fix it, or, rather, to report it, as she saw fit. At some point, I realized she was walking onto my property with a purpose, to find something wrong. She wasn't just a concerned neighbor. She was a self-appointed judge and jury, looking for any flaw she could latch onto, no matter how small or inconsequential it was. And, to make matters worse, she had started making calls. I don't know if she was trying to rally support from others or if she was simply going rogue, but she seemed to think that if she complained enough, someone would listen. So she called the cops. Yes, you heard that right. She called the police on me. Her argument? That I was a troublemaker on a piece of land I owned and that I wasn't keeping it up to her HOA standards. The claim was absurd. It was laughable. She had no jurisdiction over my property, no authority to demand anything from me, and no reason to involve law enforcement in a situation that had nothing to do with the public good. But somehow in her mind, if something was untidy or didn't match her strict, suburban idea of order, it was grounds for legal action. She took this small, personal issue and escalated it into something that now involved the cops. She accused me of being irresponsible, of letting my property fall into chaos, as though I was some kind of menace to the neighborhood. In her twisted view, if something didn't meet her standards, then it was a problem, and it needed to be addressed, no matter what the cost. I still couldn't wrap my head around the fact that this woman, who didn't even live near me, had called the authorities on me over a few cattle roaming, a fence that needed repair, and a barnyard that wasn't as perfectly tidy as she would have liked. I wasn't in her HOA, and I certainly wasn't going to follow her rules. But to HOA Karen, there was no room for negotiation. If it didn't fit within the narrow confines of what she deemed acceptable, she'd make it someone else's problem. She decided to drag me into her world of control and regulation, and now I had to deal with the fallout of her misguided actions. What was even more ridiculous was that the cops had no real legal reason to be there. They were simply responding to a complaint that had no legitimate foundation, and yet they were forced to come out and inspect my property because of HOA Karen's obsessive need to report what she considered violations. It was exhausting and frustrating. What was meant to be a peaceful day on my ranch had turned into a bureaucratic nightmare, all because one person couldn't mind their own business. But little did she know, her attempt to control my life was about to have consequences. This would not end quietly. I wasn't going to let her turn my peaceful property into a battleground for her misguided sense of order. And as I soon found out, this little violation of hers was just the beginning of a much bigger clash between us. The sheriff's office had to get involved after HOA Karen's repeated complaints. I'd been getting the occasional phone call, but now it had escalated to the point where the sheriff's department was knocking on my door. It started innocently enough. They called me up one day, explaining that they'd received a formal complaint from the local HOA, specifically from HOA Karen, who had raised a number of issues about my property. They told me that they needed to check on the situation, and that a sheriff's deputy would be sent out to inspect my land. Of course, I understood that the sheriff's department was just doing its job. They had to respond to complaints. But this whole thing? It was quickly spiraling into something that didn't make sense. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was starting to feel like a bad joke. Here I was, minding my business, trying to keep things running smoothly on my ranch, and now I had to deal with a situation where I was being scrutinized by law enforcement over a dispute that had no real foundation. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. This whole thing was so ridiculous. I almost didn't know whether to be frustrated or amused. I wasn't even in HOA Karen's HOA. I didn't live in her neighborhood, I didn't have to abide by her rules, and I certainly didn't give her the right to judge me, let alone get law enforcement involved. But somehow here we were. My name was on a report, and I was now facing a formal inspection of my property, all because one overly meddlesome neighbor had decided that my life didn't meet her standards. The whole idea that I had to prove my innocence over something so absurd was baffling. My ranch was well kept, my cattle were well fed, and there was absolutely nothing illegal going on. So why was I having to justify myself? Why was I spending my precious time explaining that I wasn't breaking any rules, let alone being inspected by a law enforcement officer for something as trivial as a few fallen fence posts and some overgrown grass? I felt like I was stuck in an episode of some absurd sitcom where everything was blown out of proportion. A routine check over a few minor issues on my land had now turned into an official investigation, all because HOA Karen had decided to play judge and jury. What was next? Was she going to call the fire department because I had a pile of firewood that hadn't been stacked properly? Was I going to end up on the evening news as some kind of rogue rancher because I didn't follow the invisible HOA laws of a neighborhood I wasn't even part of? So, as soon as I hung up the phone with the sheriff's office, I immediately asked for more details. If this was going to happen, I at least wanted to understand what I was up against. The deputy on the other end of the line was patient but firm. "We need to send someone to inspect your property," they said. "It's been flagged as a serious complaint. I know this might sound odd, but we have to follow through." The word serious caught my attention. Serious? What could possibly be serious about a few fallen fence posts and some cattle grazing where they shouldn't be? Was this really happening? I could barely keep the frustration from building up as I responded. "Seriously? This is a serious complaint? We're talking about a few cattle in an open field and a couple of broken fence posts." The sheriff assured me that, yes, they had to follow up on the complaint. It was routine, they said, but I could tell that even they were perplexed about the situation. The sheriff's office had a job to do, of course, and I understood that they had to respond to complaints, especially if they were from someone with enough time on their hands to get that obsessive about the details. Still, as I waited for the officer to arrive, I couldn't shake the absurdity of the entire situation. It was becoming clear to me that HOA Karen's mission to create a pristine, rule-abiding world was one that she was determined to impose on everyone around her, no matter the cost. I wasn't even a part of her HOA, and I wasn't about to let her dictate how I managed my land. But here we were. I couldn't believe I was having to stand in front of law enforcement over something as trivial as this. The whole thing seemed like a waste of time, not just for me, but for the sheriff's department too. These were real issues that the police were supposed to be dealing with. Crimes, emergencies, things that actually mattered. And now, they were having to step in and investigate a so-called violation that was the result of a neighborhood busybody who was too obsessed with the idea of controlling others to mind her own business. When the sheriff's deputy finally arrived, I could tell they weren't thrilled about the situation either. They stepped out of their patrol car, looked around the property with a raised eyebrow, and then turned to me with an almost apologetic look. "I have to do this," they said, "but I can't say I see anything that's a major issue here." I didn't even know how to respond. What else could I say? I was grateful that the deputy didn't seem to take this seriously, but at the same time, the fact that I was even standing there, explaining myself, felt absurd. The deputy and I walked around the property, and I showed them the areas that had supposedly been flagged by HOA Karen. The broken fences? Sure, they were a little ragged, but they weren't dangerous. The cattle roaming? Totally normal for the area. And the untidy barnyard? It was a working farm, not a suburban lawn. It wasn't supposed to look perfect. Everything seemed to check out, and I could tell the sheriff's deputy wasn't convinced that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. But despite all of this, the situation was far from over. I had no idea where this would go. Even though the deputy seemed to understand how ridiculous this all was, the mere fact that they had to inspect my property was enough to prove just how far HOA Karen had taken this. I was stuck in a situation that shouldn't have existed, facing a serious complaint from someone who had no business even being involved in my life. It was the sheer absurdity of the thing that frustrated me the most. I had been dragged into a mess because of someone who couldn't let go of their need to control. And as I stood there, with the sheriff's deputy inspecting my property, I realized something important. This wasn't just about the ranch. It wasn't about the cattle or the fences or the barn. This was about someone trying to impose their worldview on me. Someone who thought they had the right to define how I lived, even though they had no business doing so. And no matter how serious the sheriff's office thought this wasn't going to end quietly. I knew I had to stand my ground. The problem was, I wasn't sure exactly how far HOA Karen would go to make my life miserable. But one thing was clear. This was far from over. The sheriff's office might have been investigating, but I wasn't about to let someone like HOA Karen dictate how I ran my ranch. This was just the beginning, and I wasn't backing down. I decided that I couldn't just sit back and let this nonsense continue. This whole ordeal had become way too absurd, and I wasn't about to let HOA Karen's obsessive need to control my property escalate further. The sheriff's department had been called in, yes, but now it was time for me to take matters into my own hands. I needed to get ahead of this situation, clear my name once and for all, and prove that I wasn't some lawless rancher. But I also knew that I couldn't afford to underestimate the power of the law, even if I knew the whole thing was based on her delusional complaints. I reached out to a few friends I had in law enforcement. I'd known them for years. Some were old buddies from when I used to volunteer for the local fire department, and others were just good people who understood how things worked around here. They weren't just cops, but friends who understood rural life and what it meant to work the land. They were the kind of people who knew the difference between someone genuinely breaking the law and someone like HOA Karen, who was just trying to make mountains out of molehills. I explained the situation to them, told them about the complaints, and asked for advice. Each of them assured me that as long as I wasn't violating any actual laws, things like zoning regulations, animal cruelty, or public safety, I didn't have anything to worry about. They reminded me that I had every right to maintain my property however I saw fit, as long as I wasn't creating a dangerous situation for the public or breaking any serious codes. As I listened to their reassurances, I felt a little bit of the tension leave my shoulders. But even though I knew deep down that HOA Karen's complaints didn't have a legal leg to stand on, I still wasn't about to take any chances. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the whole situation was getting out of hand. HOA Karen was just one person, but she was determined to make it seem like I was this rogue, unruly rancher who couldn't follow even the most basic rules. I couldn't allow her to keep casting this shadow over me. The more I considered it, the more frustrated I became. Who did she think she was? Did she honestly believe that she could enforce her rules on my property, even though I didn't live in her neighborhood and wasn't bound by her HOA's restrictions? So, after some thought, I made up my mind. I would confront this head-on. It wasn't just about defending myself. It was about setting the record straight once and for all. I wasn't going to let her control me from afar, creating a narrative where I was the bad guy. I knew I had to meet with the sheriff, go over everything with him, and show them just how ridiculous the whole thing was. If I could prove to the sheriff that this was all a matter of a disgruntled neighbor with too much time on her hands, I could end this nonsense once and for all. I called up the sheriff's office and arranged to meet with one of their deputies. They told me they were more than willing to come out to the ranch to conduct the inspection, but I didn't want to just stand there and be passive. I wanted to show them the full picture. I didn't want them walking around with only HOA Karen's version of events in mind. I wanted them to see firsthand the way things were, from my perspective. So, I made the decision to personally walk the sheriff around the property, point out the areas she had flagged, and give my side of the story. When the day of the inspection came, I was a bundle of nerves and frustration. I met the sheriff at the edge of my property, near the barn where the alleged violations had supposedly occurred. As soon as we started walking, I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. The sheriff was calm, professional, and serious, but I couldn't help but notice that they seemed a little skeptical about the entire ordeal. I wasn't sure if it was because they were used to these kinds of ridiculous complaints or if they genuinely saw through the far-fetched nature of HOA Karen's accusations. Either way, they were open to listening, which I appreciated. I started with the cattle. HOA Karen had claimed that they were wandering too far beyond the designated grazing areas, causing chaos in her perfectly ordered world. The truth, it was just cattle being cattle, Yes, sometimes they wandered a little further out, but they weren't causing any harm. As we walked past the fields, I pointed out the area where the cattle were grazing, and I explained how I managed the herd. The fences. Sure, some of the posts had fallen over after a recent storm, but they weren't dangerous. I was already in the process of repairing them. I made sure the sheriff understood that this wasn't a situation where animals were escaping or where the public safety was in danger. The sheriff nodded along, clearly taking it all in. We walked past the barn, where HOA Karen had made claims about the area being untidy. To her, it was a complete eyesore, something that violated her sense of order. To me, it was just a normal mess that comes with owning and operating a ranch. There were old hay bales that needed to be cleared, farm equipment that had been left out overnight. Not the most aesthetic scene, sure, but not a violation of anything that would warrant a formal complaint. The sheriff looked over the area, nodding thoughtfully, but I could see in their eyes that they were starting to doubt the validity of the complaint. As we continued walking, I could tell that the sheriff wasn't fully buying into HOA Karen's narrative. They were calm, but there was a certain skepticism in their body language, something that made me think they were already aware that this was more about HOA Karen's overzealous sense of control than any real violations of the law. I could feel the tension start to lift from my shoulders as we made our way around the property. The sheriff was listening, observing, and clearly processing everything I was saying. By the time we reached the far corner of the ranch, I could tell that they were convinced. This wasn't a matter of public safety or property damage. It wasn't a serious complaint at all, just a petty complaint from someone who was bored and needed to pick fights. When we finished the walk, the sheriff gave me a look that said it all. "I don't see anything here that's a violation of the law," they said, shaking their head. "This is really more of a personal dispute than anything else." I let out a deep breath of relief. I knew I hadn't been in the wrong, but hearing the sheriff's professional assessment was the final piece of the puzzle. I was right. HOA Karen had overstepped her bounds and was trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. The whole thing was ridiculous, but at least now it was clear to the authorities that I wasn't the problem. We talked a bit more, and the sheriff assured me that the report would be closed soon. They'd have to file some paperwork, but as far as they were concerned, this was nothing more than a neighbor with a grudge who didn't understand the limits of her authority. After the sheriff left, I stood there on my land, taking in the wide-open spaces, feeling the relief of knowing that I had cleared my name. It wasn't over yet, but it was one big step in the right direction. I still had to deal with HOA Karen, but I was no longer alone in this. Now I had the backing of law enforcement, and I wasn't going to let her try to take control of my life any longer. After the sheriff left, I sat down and took a long, deep breath. The air around me felt heavy, like the weight of everything that had just transpired was still settling in. I gazed out across the ranch, letting the stillness of the moment wash over me. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, emotionally and mentally. The past few hours felt like a blur, a whirlwind of stress, confusion, and frustration. I had been forced to explain myself to law enforcement for something so trivial, something that should never have escalated this far. As I sat there, the reality of it all began to sink in. HOA Karen had already cost me time, energy, and hours of dealing with law enforcement. And for what? Over a few fallen fence posts and some stray cattle? It was almost laughable, but the toll it had taken on me was anything but. I had spent the entire afternoon showing the sheriff around my property, explaining every little detail, every so-called violation. My mind was still spinning from the absurdity of it all. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of injustice. This wasn't just about me. This was about anyone who had the misfortune of being on the receiving end of someone like HOA Karen, someone who felt they had the right to impose their rules on others, without any sense of what was reasonable or fair. I had the legal knowledge, the support, and the resources to fight back, but most people don't. What if someone else had been caught up in something like this, without the means or the time to stand up for themselves? Someone who didn't know how to navigate the legal system, who didn't have friends in law enforcement to guide them. The thought of how easily she could have ruined someone's life without consequence was a sobering one. I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't just walk away from this situation and let her think she had won. My anger started to boil again as I thought about what had just happened. She had used law enforcement as a tool in her petty, personal crusade, wasting public resources and causing unnecessary stress, all because she wanted to control something that wasn't hers to control. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was harassment. And harassment, as far as I was concerned, had consequences. HOA Karen had tried to take something away from me. My peace of mind, my reputation, my time. And I wasn't about to let her get away with it without facing any repercussions. It was one thing to complain about something you thought was wrong, but it was another thing entirely to use law enforcement to back up your baseless, delusional complaints. She had crossed a line. That's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. This could be costly for her, too. I had rights, and those rights meant that I could file a lawsuit for harassment. I could go after her for wasting law enforcement's time and resources. After all, everything she had claimed was false, and she knew it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that she wasn't just some well-meaning but misguided neighbor. She was malicious. She was fully aware that her complaints were baseless, yet she still chose to go to the sheriff's office and report me, knowing that it would cause a stir and create a problem where none existed. That wasn't just annoying. It was downright malicious. And malicious behavior has consequences. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without having to answer for it. The whole situation was entirely of her making, and I wasn't about to let her get away with using the law as a weapon. If she thought she could throw around false accusations and waste public resources without facing any repercussions, she was sorely mistaken. I stood up and paced around the property, the wheels in my head spinning faster and faster as I pieced everything together. If I was going to do this, I needed to make sure I had everything in order. I couldn't just make a claim without evidence. That wasn't how this worked. No, I had to build my case. I had to make sure I was fully prepared to fight back, and I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. I immediately started gathering everything I could find. First, I went through my text messages and emails. I had been in contact with her a few times over the years, though I didn't expect to find anything too revealing at first. But as I went through the exchanges, I started noticing patterns, things that I hadn't thought of in the heat of the moment, but which now stood out in hindsight. There were emails where she had sent me unprompted suggestions for how I should be maintaining my property. These were clearly oversteps, unsolicited advice that had no basis in reality. She had assumed that because we lived in the same general area, she had the right to dictate how I ran my land. That was her first mistake. Then I pulled out my phone and started looking through the pictures I had taken of the property after receiving the complaints. I had made sure to document everything, every broken fence post, every cattle grazing where they shouldn't, and yes, every so-called mess she had claimed was a violation. As I scrolled through the photos, it became more and more evident. There was nothing here that warranted her calls to the sheriff's office. It wasn't even close. The cattle were contained, the fences were in the process of being repaired, and the barnyard was exactly what you'd expect from a working farm. There was nothing untidy about it. It was functional, practical, and definitely not a violation of anything except HOA Karen's personal sense of what was acceptable. The more I dug, the more convinced I became. This wasn't just about one isolated complaint. This was about someone who had a pattern of meddling, who had a history of making problems for others. She had wasted public resources, dragged law enforcement into something completely unnecessary, and then had the audacity to act as if it was all justified. The more I gathered, the more I realized that this mistake, her mistake, could cost her a lot more than just a bad reputation. I pulled out a notebook and started jotting down all the possible legal avenues. I could sue her for harassment. I could sue for wasting law enforcement's time. I could file for damages, if it came to that. And if I really wanted to go the extra mile, I could seek compensation for emotional distress, the time lost in dealing with this absurd situation. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about making a point. It was about showing her that you can't just make accusations and expect to get away with it. At that moment, I felt a sense of clarity. She had underestimated me. She thought I would just roll over, that I would let her trample over my property and my life without consequence. But now I had a plan. I wasn't going to let her continue her crusade unchecked. It wasn't just about standing up for myself. It was about setting a precedent for anyone else she might try to target. I wasn't going to let her get away with making my life miserable just because she felt entitled to dictate how things should be. And so, I started preparing for the next step. I wasn't going to let her think she had won. Not this time. I wasn't about to let HOA Karen get away with what she had done. Not this time. The frustration that had been building inside me for days, no, weeks, had reached a boiling point. I had spent enough time running around, explaining myself to the sheriff, gathering evidence, and dealing with the aftermath of her ridiculous complaints. This was not just a simple misunderstanding, and it wasn't a situation where I could just let her off the hook. No, she had crossed a line, and it was time for her to face the consequences. I wasn't about to stand idly by and let her think she could throw her weight around without repercussions. I was done being the victim here. I had been plotting this moment for a while. I knew the time had come to confront her, to make sure she understood exactly what kind of mess she had created. I didn't care that she had tried to paint herself as some righteous crusader. I wasn't buying it anymore. I wasn't going to let her escape unscathed. I had done my homework. I had built my case, and now it was time to see her squirm. I scheduled a meeting with her. I didn't give her a chance to make excuses or try to avoid it. If she wanted to play this game, she was going to play by my rules. I walked up to her front door, stood there for a moment, and took a deep breath. I could feel the weight of the moment on my shoulders, but I was ready. As soon as the door creaked open, I didn't hesitate. The expression on her face when she saw me standing there was priceless. She clearly wasn't expecting this. Her eyes widened for a split second, and I could tell she was trying to process how the tables had turned. This wasn't some quiet, one-sided conversation where she could brush me off. No, this was the moment she was going to have to face the consequences of her actions, and there was no escaping it. She tried to act all high and mighty, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. She straightened her back, adjusted her glasses, and tried to play it off as though she was the one in charge. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice cold, trying to feign disinterest. She crossed her arms, as if trying to protect herself, but I wasn't buying it. This wasn't going to be some polite conversation where we danced around the issue. This was me taking control. I didn't waste any time. I wasn't here for pleasantries or to let her sugarcoat what she had done. I was here to make sure she knew exactly how much trouble she had caused me, and how serious this was. "Listen, Karen," I said firmly, my voice steady and unwavering. "You've caused enough trouble for me. You sent the cops to my property for no reason, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." Her eyes flashed with a mix of surprise and disbelief. I could see her trying to process what I was saying, trying to figure out how to weasel her way out of it. She wasn't expecting me to come to her door like this, ready to confront her with the full force of what I had uncovered. But there was no turning back now. I stepped closer, and that's when I dropped the bombshell. "You've made a costly mistake," I added, letting the weight of those words hang in the air. I wasn't going to let her off the hook this time. I had enough evidence to not only defend myself, but to possibly take legal action. I had kept track of every text message, every email, every photo I had taken of my property. I had all the proof I needed that her complaints were not only baseless, but also malicious. As I laid it all out for her, the pictures, the screenshots of emails, the documentation from the sheriff department, everything, I could see her face slowly drain of color. Her eyes shifted nervously, her shoulders tensed up, and she tried to hide her panic behind a forced calm. But it was too late for that. She had made her choice, and now she was going to have to live with it. "You've wasted law enforcement's time," I continued, making sure she understood the severity of what she had done. "You've caused me hours of stress, and you've dragged my name through the mud for something that doesn't even exist. And worst of all, you did it knowingly." Her face went pale as the weight of her actions began to settle in. She was no longer the confident, controlling woman she had once been. Now, she was backed into a corner, and there was no way out. Her body language gave her away. The fidgeting with her hands, the way she nervously avoided eye contact, and the slight tremble in her voice when she finally spoke. No, it's not like that," she stammered, trying to recover. "It was just a misunderstanding. I was just trying to help. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Her words were weak, almost desperate, as she tried to backpedal from the situation. She was floundering now, no longer the confident woman who had made false claims and wasted everyone's time. She was trying to pull the rug out from under everything, to pretend that she had simply been trying to be a good neighbor. But I wasn't having it. "A misunderstanding," I scoffed. "Karen, you knew exactly what you were doing. You didn't just make one complaint. You sent the cops to my property. You wasted public resources, and you try to make me out to be some kind of criminal when all I've done is run my ranch. You knew all along that there was no real violation, and yet you chose to drag me through this mess." I watched her falter, her carefully constructed facade crumbling in front of me. She wasn't so confident now. She had pushed me too far, and now she was realizing the consequences. She had no idea I had been preparing for this moment, that I had everything lined up. She thought she could get away with causing trouble for me, but she was wrong. Her eyes darted around, as if she were looking for an escape, some way to back out of the situation. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she repeated, but it was clear she knew her words were falling flat. The damage was done, and there was no going back. She had tried to play the victim, but I wasn't buying it. I stood my ground, unyielding. "The truth is, Karen, this could cost you a lot more than just a bad reputation. You've crossed a line, and you're going to have to answer for it. I'm done being the punching bag in your little game." For a moment, there was silence. The tension between us was palpable. I could see her scrambling for an excuse, but she didn't have one. There was no way to explain away what she had done. No amount of backpedaling was going to fix it now. She had taken it too far, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. I'm sorry," she muttered, her voice barely audible, but it was too little, too late. Her apology didn't change the fact that she had escalated a petty issue into a serious one. It didn't erase the hours I had spent explaining myself to the sheriff, or the stress she had caused me, or the possibility of legal action hanging over her head. I gave her one last, steady look before I turned and walked away. "It's too late for apologies, Karen," I said over my shoulder, my voice firm. "The damage has been done." As I left her door behind, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. This was just the beginning of the fallout for HOA Karen, but as far as I was concerned, it was over for me. I had taken control. I had confronted her, laid out the evidence, and made it clear that there were consequences for her actions. She had no idea what was coming next. In the end, HOA Karen realized just how far overstepping her boundaries had taken her. Not only had she wasted public resources, but she had also opened herself up to legal action. After some tense back and forth, she decided to drop the complaints, and I was able to move on with my life. The whole ordeal was a reminder that some people can be obsessed with rules that don't apply to others, but also that standing up for yourself can really make a difference. Now, every time I walk around my ranch, I can't help but smile. I didn't let HOA Karen win, and the lesson here? Don't mess with someone who knows their rights. You just might end up paying the price.